Hello, my friends. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions help the channel grow, so don't forget to support. I never understood why people romanticize the desert. They said things like open skies, quiet nights, freedom. But to me, after what happened, the desert will always be a place where the world feels thin, where something old and hungry pushes right up against the other side. My trouble started the summer I took a solo contract job inspecting communication towers stretching across Nevada. It was good money, quiet work, and I honestly welcomed the isolation. A few months earlier, my younger brother Mark had disappeared on a road trip through Arizona. No trace, no note, not even a piece of his car. The investigation stalled, and I was left with silence. I needed something to drown it out. I spent the first week driving dirt roads, climbing towers, recording data, and camping alone. Nothing unusual. But on the 8th day, when my GPS started glitching, I veered off course and found myself somewhere I didn't recognize. A flat stretch of sand and rock, no tire tracks, no fencing, no distant highway hum. Just heat. Thick, shimmering desert heat. I was about to turn back when something caught my eye. A shimmer, a movement. It looked like a man walking across the sand about half a mile ahead. But the way he moved was strange. Jerky, uncertain, like his limbs didn't quite belong to him. I reached for my binoculars. What I saw froze me. It wasn't a man, or if it had been once, it wasn't anymore. Its body was stretched too long, too thin, swaying like it had to think before every step. Its head jerked left, then right, scanning in a weirdly rhythmic pattern. And then it stopped walking and tilted its face up, straight toward me. Even from that distance, I felt a prickle crawl down my back. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into reverse, spun around, and drove until my hands stopped shaking. I told myself it was dehydration, a mirage, heat stress, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Mirages don't turn to look at you. 2 days later, I climbed a tower near the edge of a remote protected area. The map called it Red Basin Reserve, but when I looked it up earlier, I found nothing about it. No ranger stations, no trails, nothing. It was like the land officially existed, but unofficially didn't. The climb up the tower went smoothly. The climb down did not. Halfway down, I noticed fresh footprints in the sand below. They weren't mine. They weren't human. They were long impressions, almost like a person had dragged their feet in 2 straight lines, each step too evenly spaced. I froze on the ladder, gripping the metal until my knuckles went white. The desert was silent, too silent, until I heard something faint moving around the base of the tower. A soft, deliberate shifting of sand. My body locked up. I didn't dare breathe. Then whatever it was moved directly under me. The ladder vibrated. I didn't think. I dropped the last 12 feet, hit the ground hard, and sprinted toward my truck. When I slammed the door shut and turned the ignition, there was a sound. Something scraping the metal behind the cab. I floored it, kicking up a cloud of dust, and didn't stop driving until the tower was only a thin shadow on the horizon. That night I camped far from Red Basin, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept thinking about the footprints, the movement in the sand, and the glancing shape I'd seen days earlier. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. Something brushing against my tent, slow, dragging, too measured to be the wind. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to reveal where I was facing. The brushing circled the tent, then stopped near my head. I held my breath. A moment passed. Then something pressed against the nylon, a long, thin hand. Not a palm, more like a jointed limb with too many knuckles, feeling the shape of my skull through the fabric. My lungs screamed for air, but I stayed frozen. After what felt like minutes, the pressure lifted. The brushing continued around the tent, then grew faint, then stopped. I waited another half hour before moving. When I finally unzipped the tent, nothing was there. No footprints, no tracks, just undisturbed sand. That's when I started to wonder if whatever it was avoided leaving tracks when it didn't want to be seen. The next day, I packed up camp and drove toward the nearest small town, nearly 3 hours away. I needed people, civilization, anything. But 30 minutes into the drive, I saw something that made me slam the brakes. A car half buried in the sand, a silver Honda Civic. My brother's truck had been the same color, same shape. My heart climbed into my throat as I stepped out, the heat baking my skin. It wasn't his vehicle, but the scene was all wrong. The car door was open. The sand around the vehicle was disturbed in that same straight-line dragging pattern. Something had moved around it, circling it, inspecting it. The windshield was cracked from the inside, like someone had slammed their head into it trying to escape. My stomach knotted. Whatever stalked me on the tower, whatever touched my tent last night, it had been inside this car when the owner tried to flee. The glove box was open. Inside, a torn map highlighted a route through Red Basin Reserve. Written across it in shaky handwriting were 3 words: "Don't look at it." I stood there for a long time, breathing the hot air, feeling watched. The desert suddenly felt like a living thing holding its breath. I backed away slowly and returned to my truck. As I drove off, something moved in my rearview mirror, a shoulder rising from behind the Civic, then a head, then a body unfolding upward, too tall, too thin, turning toward the road in that same jerky rhythm. My vision blurred as panic surged through me. I nearly ran off the road. It was following me. I didn't stop driving until I reached a tiny gas station marked Eagle Dust Stop. It looked abandoned except for an old Navajo man leaning against the shade of the building. His eyes tracked my truck as I pulled in, his expression tightening. "You came from the west," he said before I even opened my door. I nodded. "You saw it." Not a question, a statement. I swallowed hard. I think something's out there." He looked back toward the endless stretch of desert and shook his head. "Not something. Not anymore." His voice was gravelly, worn. This land wasn't meant for us, not for anyone. Before there were borders, before towns and roads, my ancestors called that place the thin stretch, where the skin between worlds wears too small and something from the other side can slip in. I felt a chill despite the heat. "What does it want?" He met my eyes. "To become you." Become me? It watches, learns, mimics, poorly at first, but it gets better the longer it stares. When it knows enough, when it understands how to wear you, it takes you, leaves nothing behind. My stomach twisted. Has anyone escaped it? No one who saw its full face ever did. My hands trembled. My brother disappeared near here months ago. Do you think? The old man raised a hand sharply. If it took him, you cannot help him. The only reason you're alive is because it has not finished understanding you yet. Something moved behind the gas station. Not the creature, the sun shifting, a shadow, but I still jumped. "Go," he said. "Drive east. Don't look back. Don't stop until the land rises and the air cools. If you feel it watching you, which you will, keep going. It cannot follow you past the foothills." Why? Too much life there, too many eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch, tying it around my wrist. "This won't stop it, but it will make it harder for it to copy you." I thanked him and got into my truck. As I pulled out of the lot, the man didn't wave or nod. He simply closed his eyes, like he already knew what would happen next. For the first hour, nothing. Then I felt it. That prickling awareness, that pressure in the air. I checked the mirror against the old man's warning. I shouldn't have looked. About a quarter mile behind me, something moved across the sand in a straight line, fast and smooth like it wasn't touching the ground. Long limbs trailing, head jerking in sharp angles, always tilting toward me. A cold sweat broke across my body. I pressed the accelerator so hard my foot cramped. The truck roared, engine straining. But every few minutes, when I forced myself not to check, I still sensed it, closing the distance. At one point, I swear I heard something like my name being whispered, not from outside the truck, from inside my head. It wasn't a voice, it was a copy of a voice. My voice. I nearly blacked out. Hours passed. The land finally began to rise. The air thinned and cooled. The desert fell behind me. And slowly, so slowly I barely noticed, the pressure eased. The feeling of being watched faded. When I reached a small mountain town, I pulled into a diner parking lot and immediately slumped over the wheel, shaking violently. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke to someone tapping on the window, a police officer. "You okay, sir? You've been parked here since before dawn." I blinked. "What time is it?" "Almost noon." Noon. I'd slept for nearly 10 hours. I nodded, trying to gather myself. The officer gave an understanding look and walked away. I felt safe, really safe, for the first time in days. The next week, I quit my job and went back home. But I never forgot the desert, or the tower, or the thing that pressed its hand against my tent. I never forgot the old man's warning either. And I wouldn't be telling this story now if everything had ended there. 2 nights ago, as I sat alone in my living room, I caught movement through the window. A tall silhouette standing perfectly still across the street. Too still. Watching my house. My heart began to hammer. I turned off the lights and crouched low, staring through a gap in the curtains. The figure didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, its head tilted at an angle no human spine could manage. It was the same jagged tilt I had seen in the desert. My breath froze in my throat. The old man told me it couldn't follow me into the foothills. But I'm not in the foothills anymore. And I think it learned enough about me. Last night I heard something move in my hallway. Long, slow steps, almost confident, almost practiced, like it had finally learned how to walk the way I do. I'm writing this now with the door locked, but the footsteps stopped outside my room 10 minutes ago. It hasn't tried the handle yet. I don't know if it's waiting for me to stop typing or breathing or hoping I'll be stupid enough to open the door myself. But I do know one thing. Whatever is standing on the other side of this door looks exactly like me now. And when it wears me fully, no one will ever know the difference. I never should have taken that job. I thought I was tough, used to being alone and able to handle the isolation of the desert. I was wrong. The desert isn't just empty sand and sun. It's alive in a way that chills you when the sun sets. And that night, I realized I wasn't alone. I was working as a freelance surveyor, mapping out utility lines across the Mojave. My work required long drives on dirt roads, climbing ridges, and camping in the open. I liked it. Quiet, solitary, but the solitude turned sour the moment I left the last paved road. I didn't know it yet, but I had wandered into a part of the desert locals didn't talk about, and now I was trapped in it. The first strange thing happened on the 4th day. I was driving down a narrow trail, the tires of my truck kicking up dust in the golden sunset. I'd been following the GPS coordinates for a new utility pole, but the path seemed to twist unnaturally, like it was leading me somewhere it didn't want me to go. Then I saw it, a figure standing perfectly still on a rocky outcrop. I slowed down. The figure was human in shape, but wrong. Too tall, too thin. Its head tilted in a way that no human head could tilt, and it stared at me with eyes that glinted like black mirrors. I blinked. When I looked again, it was gone. My pulse quickened, but I chalked it up to fatigue and the trick of the light. Later, when I set up camp near a dry wash, the night brought something worse. The air turned icy despite the desert heat. I was lying in my tent when I felt it, an oppressive presence pressing down from outside. The sand around the tent shifted, as if someone, or something, was moving in a deliberate pattern. I stayed perfectly still, pretending to sleep, but I could feel its attention. Hours passed. I eventually dozed, only to wake to tracks leading from the edge of the wash directly to my tent. They were too long to be human, uneven, as though the creature dragging itself had been cautious, studying me. I grabbed my rifle from the back of the truck, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. Nothing. Just desert. But the tracks didn't stop at the tent. They vanished into the air itself, leaving a space of empty sand as though the earth refused to hold them. I didn't sleep again that night. I started driving at first light, hoping to find civilization. The desert stretched endlessly, the sun climbing mercilessly. Around noon, I noticed my truck's odometer seemed stuck. I'd driven for hours, but the numbers hardly changed. My GPS blinked, then went blank. Every compass app I had spun uselessly. I was lost, and I knew it. As the sun began to lower, a new horror appeared. Shadows began to stretch across the desert in unnatural ways. Rocks that should have cast short shadows now stretched like fingers. I saw movement in the distance, something pacing along the ridges, slow and measured. My heart sank. It had been following me, and it had learned my patterns. Night fell fast, swallowing the desert in black. I parked the truck and set up camp in a small dip, hoping the uneven terrain might hide me. That's when I saw the lights. Faint, flickering, like lanterns, but they moved across the desert, heading straight for me. No human settlements were anywhere near here. No roads, no trails, just empty wasteland. The lights came closer, too precise, too deliberate. I tried to ignore them, but the feeling of being watched intensified, pressing into my chest. I stayed awake, waiting. Hours passed and the lights vanished. I dared a glance outside the tent. The sand was smooth again, except for a single track leading away from my camp. I followed it instinctively, and what I found made my stomach drop. A car, half buried in the sand. A desert rat or coyote had torn the upholstery, but the real terror was inside. Bones. Human bones, scattered and broken. No signs of struggle, just scattered remains, as if the person had been unmade slowly. I looked closer and found a note, weathered and yellowed, almost illegible. It said 3 words: "Don't follow me." I didn't need to read it twice. I ran back to the truck, heart hammering. I drove until the desert became nightmarishly black, every shadow hinting at something moving just out of sight. That's when I first heard it, a voice whispering my name. Not through the truck, not through the radio, but inside my head. My name, clear, deliberate. I shook my head and screamed, but the voice didn't stop. I kept moving, driving blind through dirt and sand. Then I saw them. Figures in the darkness, pacing along the ridges, hundreds of them, or maybe fewer. My mind couldn't tell. They were human shapes, but wrong. Elongated, tilting heads and spindly limbs. They moved in the desert like it was theirs. And maybe it was. I realized I wasn't the first to wander here. And if those lights, those figures, had followed the others, I didn't want to find out what happened next. The next morning, I awoke to find my truck surrounded by footprints. Not human. Long, thin, dragging. Some circled the truck, others led toward the horizon. I considered leaving the truck and running, but I needed it to survive. Then I saw something on the hood. A single human finger, impossibly long, resting there. I vomited. I drove again, this time trying to keep track of every ridge, every landmark. But the desert seemed to shift. Mountains I had seen before now appeared behind me or to the side. Trails I thought led east now curved back west. I realized something terrifying. The desert itself was alive, or at least it had agents, creatures that knew the land better than any human. By the 4th day, I was hallucinating. My water supply was low, the sun unbearable. I saw my own reflection in a puddle of mud. For a moment, I thought it blinked independently of me. My reflection smiled when I didn't. I slammed the truck door, trying to convince myself I was losing it. But that night, the tent shook violently. Sand sprayed inside, covering my sleeping bag. Something had crawled over the truck, running its fingers across the roof, dragging nails that left shallow grooves. I ran. No, I didn't run. I fled blindly. The truck bounced along the dirt, wheels digging into the soft sand. Every mile I gained felt like I was moving through molasses. At some point, I lost the truck entirely. I woke on the sand, dehydrated and half-conscious, the stars so bright they burned my eyes. Then I saw a shape moving toward me, a figure taller than any man, walking with impossible precision, limbs bending the wrong way. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The presence alone filled the desert, pressing into my chest, freezing my blood. I crawled backward, trying to make it think I was still unconscious. But when I looked up again, I realized it had multiplied. Shapes appeared across the sand, pacing, tilting, observing. They weren't just following me. They were learning me, studying my movement. I understood suddenly that this was the desert's way. It didn't just kill intruders, it copied them. It watched, learned, and when it knew enough, it replaced them. I screamed, but the desert swallowed it. I tried to run, but my legs buckled. The creatures closed in, slow, deliberate, as if giving me time to understand. I felt my identity slipping. My thoughts weren't my own. I was aware, but every second the desert was rewriting me. My memories, my movements, my very sense of self. It was copying, learning, and preparing to wear me like a mask. I thought of my friends, my family. No one would find me here. No one would even suspect. The desert keeps its secrets well. By morning, I had lost track of time, but I still remembered the old stories I'd ignored as a kid. The warnings from native elders about places where the world thins, where the desert doesn't just consume your body, but your mind. I tried to fight, screamed, prayed, begged for survival, but it was relentless. By the third night, I was convinced I wouldn't escape. I saw a ridge in the distance, a line of mountains. The one shred of hope I had was to reach them. I stumbled for hours, crawling over sand and rock, always feeling their attention behind me, learning, mimicking. When I finally reached the foothills, the figures stopped at the edge of the desert. They didn't pursue further. I collapsed at the base, gasping, shaking, unsure if I had made it or if they had simply decided I was no longer worth following. I stayed there for hours, listening to the wind in the rocks, trying to convince myself I had survived. Now, months later, I live near the mountains outside Las Vegas. I work in town, surrounded by lights, people, and the constant hum of civilization. I try not to look back, to forget the desert, but sometimes, in the quiet of night, I catch a glimpse of something at the edge of my vision. A tall figure, thin, tilting its head, learning. And I realize it didn't need to follow me. It already knows me. I don't go out after dark. I don't travel alone. I don't speak of the desert because anyone who hears will think I'm crazy. But I know the truth. The desert is alive. It watches. It learns. And if you wander too far, it doesn't just kill you. It waits until it understands you well enough to wear your life like a skin. I survived, yes, but I will never be the same. And I know one day it will find me again. I always thought of the desert as empty, flat, endless, dry. Nothing out there but sun and sand and maybe the occasional rattlesnake. I was wrong. The desert isn't empty. It's patient. It waits. And it knows how to make you feel smaller than you ever thought possible. It started the week I took a job surveying old abandoned wells in the Nevada desert. My task was simple: log their locations, check for collapse hazards, and mark them on a digital map. I liked quiet work, and I liked solitude. The town I came from never understood why I'd drive hundreds of miles just to wander the desert alone, but it gave me peace, or at least I thought it did. By the third day, I noticed the subtle oddities. Tracks that didn't belong to any animal I recognized, strange wind patterns that moved against the natural slope of the dunes, and shadows that didn't match the position of the sun. I brushed them off. Desert paranoia, I told myself. Heat exhaustion. I kept going. I found the first well on a ridge that overlooked a stretch of sand so wide it seemed endless. The well itself was just a rusted metal cylinder, barely rising above the sand. I leaned over to inspect it, checking for hazards when I felt it. a sudden drop in temperature, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. I spun around, expecting maybe a cloud, some sudden wind, but there was nothing. Just desert, sun still high and glaring. I shrugged it off and wrote down the coordinates. As I packed up, I noticed something in the sand below, a single footprint, impossibly long, stretched in a straight line down the slope. I frowned. I'd driven miles alone to get here. This footprint couldn't belong to me, or anyone I knew. I snapped a picture and shook my head, thinking some kid had wandered out here as a prank. I didn't realize how wrong I was until I drove to the second well that afternoon. The desert heat was brutal, and I had the air conditioning blasting. I kept seeing movement in my side mirrors, shapes that disappeared whenever I turned my head. I laughed nervously at myself. This is what isolation does, I thought. It makes you see things. The second well was near a dry wash. I parked and walked toward it, clipboard in hand, noting the decay in the metalwork and the cracking of the stone casing. That's when I heard it. A sound so soft I thought it might be the wind. But it wasn't. It was a footstep. Someone walking on sand, slow and careful. I froze. There's no one else out here. I spun around, flashlight ready, but the sand was empty. Nothing moved. I chalked it up to my imagination and continued the survey, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. Every step I took, I felt eyes on me, invisible, patient. And then I saw it. A figure standing atop the ridge I had just come down. It was tall, impossibly tall, thin, and its posture was unnatural. Its head was tilted to one side, and it seemed to watch me with interest. I froze, heart hammering. The desert was still, but I felt it pressing down, as though the air itself had weight. The figure vanished before I could react. I ran back to the truck. The interior of the cab felt suffocating. My hands trembled on the wheel as I drove to the next site, swearing I wouldn't look out the windows again. But the desert has a way of revealing itself in unexpected ways. That night, I set up camp near a cluster of rocks. The sun dipped low, and the desert seemed to stretch further, deeper into nothing. I cooked a small dinner, trying to calm my nerves, but sleep did not come easily. Shadows outside my tent stretched long and strange, bending against the contours of the rocks. I kept thinking I saw movement, flashes of black where nothing should have been. At some point, I dozed. I woke to the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, outside my tent. I tried to convince myself it was a coyote or the wind, but the breathing was too measured, too aware, and it came from multiple directions. My heart raced. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent quickly, swinging the light around. The desert was empty. No tracks, no sign that anyone had been there. Just sand. I sat in the tent all night, knees against my chest, waiting for the sun. When morning came, the desert seemed calm again, mercilessly sunlit and dry. But when I went outside, I noticed the tracks, hundreds of them stretching in patterns I could barely understand. They circled my campsite, then disappeared, vanishing into the sand as though they had never existed. I began to realize the desert was teaching me something, watching me, learning me. I felt it in every movement, every glance. My reflection in the rearview mirror no longer felt like my own. I kept seeing shapes in the cab, tall, thin, looming figures, and every time I turned, they vanished. I started sleeping with the keys in my hand, ready to drive, ready to flee. By the fifth day, I knew I had lost my sense of distance. The landmarks I had memorized seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. Roads I had taken for hours led me back to where I had started. The sun felt different, lower than it should have been at midday. Something in the desert was bending reality, and it was aware of me. That night, the terror became physical. I woke to scratching on the tent walls, long, thin fingers dragging across the nylon. I froze. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. The scraping circled me, slow, deliberate, as though whatever it was knew I was awake but didn't want to provoke me yet. I lay perfectly still until it stopped. Morning revealed more tracks. They led to the edge of my campsite, then up a nearby ridge. I followed them cautiously, rifle in hand, only to find the remains of a small camp, charred wood, torn cloth, nothing else. The desert had swallowed everything. No bodies, no footprints leaving the site, only the evidence of something ancient and patient. I began to see figures everywhere, shadows, tall and thin, tilting heads pacing at a distance. They mirrored my movements subtly, always out of reach. Sometimes I swear I caught one mimicking my gestures perfectly, stopping whenever I did. The desert was alive in a way I couldn't comprehend. It wasn't just sand and rock, it was a predator, and I was the prey. By the 7th day, I was nearly delirious. My water was almost gone, and I had started to hallucinate. I saw people wandering the dunes, calling my name, faces blurred and indistinct. I thought I saw my own truck, parked in a canyon that didn't exist. I chased it, only to find sand and rocks, undisturbed as if I had never been there. The final night was the worst. I'd stumbled into a shallow canyon, thinking the walls might hide me. I set up a minimal camp, exhausted, dehydrated, barely conscious. Then I saw them. Dozens of figures pacing along the rim, silhouetted against the stars, tall, thin, unnatural, heads tilting at impossible angles, eyes that reflected nothing but blackness. They didn't move toward me, but I knew they could. I tried to sleep, couldn't. I felt them learning me, studying me, preparing. And then I realized the truth. The desert didn't just want me dead. It wanted to know me, to understand me, to replace me. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of their presence. I ran. I don't know how far, hours, maybe days. The desert distorted time. Every dune was a challenge. My legs gave out, my body burned under the relentless sun. And yet, I kept moving, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant the end. At some point, I reached a ridge. The landscape changed. The sand thinned. Mountains rose ahead, foothills I recognized from the edge of a map. Behind me, the desert stretched endlessly, and I could feel their eyes, following, calculating. I crossed into the hills. They didn't follow, not yet. I stumbled into a small town, exhausted and delirious. People stared at me as I collapsed near a diner, muttering about shadows and tracks and figures. No one could understand. They never do. But I survived. Barely. And the desert didn't follow. Not beyond the foothills, at least. But I can't escape it. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I feel it learning me anyway. In my apartment, in the street, even in reflections in mirrors, I see it. Tall, thin, tilting its head, patient, waiting, knowing. The desert didn't just want to kill me. It wanted to make sure I understood what happens to those who wander too far, alone. That there are places in this world where time bends, where the land is alive, and where something waits to learn your face, your voice, your movements, until one day it can wear you like a mask. I survived, but I am not the same, and I know the desert is patient. One day it will find me again. I never should have accepted the job in the Nevada desert. I was offered good money to drive out to remote monitoring stations and check equipment, log readings, and maintain communications. The solitude appealed to me at first. I liked being alone, and I thought the desert would give me peace. But I was wrong. The desert doesn't give peace. The desert watches, waits, and remembers. The first day was normal. Long stretches of dirt roads, flat sand, distant mountains. I had my truck, my water, my GPS, and the occasional cell signal. But by the second day, things felt off. The horizon seemed wrong. I'd driven miles in a straight line, and suddenly found myself back near a twisted metal tower I had passed hours before. I swore I had taken a different route, but the desert didn't care. Maps, GPS, logic, they meant nothing out there. That evening, I set up camp near a dry wash. The sun was dipping behind the hills, the sand glowing red and orange. I cooked dinner, feeling the heat linger even as the shadows stretched long. I was alone, or I thought I was. I woke at midnight to a strange stillness. The desert had a sound all its own, a quiet that pressed in from every direction. I thought I heard footsteps in the sand outside my tent, slow, deliberate, uneven. My pulse jumped. I lay perfectly still, hoping it was a coyote, but the sound stopped suddenly, as though whatever it was waiting to strike had vanished. The next morning, I found tracks circling my camp, not dog tracks, not human, long, thin, spindly dragging marks as if someone or something had walked on stilts. I followed them cautiously. They led to the top of a small dune, then disappeared into the air itself, as if the desert had swallowed them. I started to see things, shadows moving across the dunes that didn't belong to any rock or bush. A figure in the distance, tall, impossibly thin, standing perfectly still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, like it was observing me in silence. I swore it disappeared whenever I tried to look directly at it, but sometimes, when I glanced sideways, it was closer, always closer. By the third day, I was exhausted. Water was running low. My truck's fuel gauge seemed stuck no matter how far I drove. The GPS blinked and froze, then displayed coordinates that made no sense. I was hopelessly lost in a part of the desert that didn't exist on any map. The temperature soared, the wind blew, but there was no relief. And all the while, I felt it. Eyes on me, always watching, waiting. That night, I tried to sleep in a small canyon. The walls should have protected me from the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just beyond the rock. I had my rifle with me, but I knew bullets wouldn't help. Whatever was out there didn't follow the rules. The shadows shifted unnaturally, and I could feel the desert pressing closer, tightening around me. At some point, I dozed. I woke to the sound of breathing, soft, deliberate, outside my tent. Not a coyote, not a human. Something else, something patient. I lay frozen, praying the desert would let me pass. The breathing stopped. I waited. The first light of dawn revealed no footprints, no evidence that anyone or anything had been there. Only sand. By the fifth day, reality started bending. Landmarks I had memorized appeared where they shouldn't have been. Roads I drove for hours led me back to where I had started. The horizon stretched and compressed, like the desert itself was shifting in front of me. I realized then that this was no ordinary desert. It was alive, or it had agents that could move and manipulate the sand, the air, and even my mind. That night, the desert became a maze. I followed faint trails, only to find them vanish, replaced by fresh tracks that didn't belong to me. I saw figures pacing along the dunes, tall, thin, limbs bending in impossible ways, heads tilting as if to study me. They didn't run, they didn't attack, they only observed. And I knew, deep down, that observation wasn't neutral. It was preparation. By the seventh day, I was hallucinating. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, or perhaps the desert itself. I couldn't tell. I saw people wandering the dunes, calling my name, faces blurred, shifting. I thought I saw my own truck parked in the middle of a canyon that didn't exist. I ran to it, but it was never there. The desert was rewriting itself around me, bending to its own design, ensuring I would never understand the scale of what I was in. On the eighth night, I reached a dry plateau. I was barely alive. My water was gone, my legs trembling, my mind fraying. That's when I saw the figures gather, dozens of them pacing along the edges of the plateau, silhouetted against the stars. They were tall, thin, tilting their heads at impossible angles. I realized something terrifying. They were copying me. Every movement, every gesture, patiently learning, preparing. I understood then that the desert did not kill in the way humans expect. It learns first. It studies. It absorbs your habits, your voice, your expressions, until it can replace you completely. The thought made my stomach churn. I tried to flee, stumbling down the plateau toward a ridge I thought I recognized from the map. My legs were weak, my vision blurred. but I forced myself onward. The figures did not pursue immediately. I could feel their presence, heavy and patient, pressing into my mind. I knew they were learning, watching, waiting. By dawn, I reached the ridge. Mountains rose ahead, foothills I recognized. I collapsed, too weak to move. The desert stretched behind me, endless and alive, and I felt them there. Tall, thin, patient. Not attacking, but not leaving either. I had survived, but only because I reached the foothills. The desert cannot follow beyond certain boundaries. For now. I stumbled into a small town, dehydrated, delirious. People stared at me. I mumbled incoherently about tracks, shadows, figures. No one believed me. They never do. But I survived. Barely. And the desert did not follow. Not yet. Months later, I still feel it. Sometimes in mirrors, I catch a glimpse of movement behind me. Tall, thin figures tilting their heads, watching, learning. I avoid the desert entirely. I don't travel alone. I don't go out after dark. But I know it remembers me. And I know one day it will come back for what it started. I am alive. But I am not safe. And the desert, it never forgets. I had always loved the desert in theory. Vast landscapes, endless skies, quiet solitude. But nothing could have prepared me for what really waits out there, beyond the roads, beyond the towns where even GPS loses meaning. I learned that lesson the hard way. It started when I took a short-term contract working for a private survey company. My task was simple. Drive out to remote parts of the Mojave, check old monitoring stations, record readings, and report back. The pay was good, and I thought a week alone in the desert would be a welcome escape. The first day was ordinary. Dusty roads, miles of sand, scattered Joshua trees, and the constant heat pressing down on the truck. I stopped at a small rise to take a photo for my report and noticed something odd in the distance. A thin figure standing perfectly still on a ridge. At first, I assumed it was a hiker or a survey worker like me. But as I watched, the figure's head tilted at a strange angle, unnatural. When I blinked, it vanished. I laughed it off as heat haze or exhaustion. By the second day, the desert began to feel wrong. I drove for hours and ended up back where I had started. Landmarks I had memorized no longer matched. My GPS glitched, giving coordinates that made no sense. I stopped to check my maps, but even they seemed to warp. I began to suspect that the desert itself wasn't static, that it moved, reshaping itself around me. That night, I camped in a dry wash, surrounded by jagged rocks. The sun had set and the shadows stretched unnaturally long. I felt eyes on me, though I knew I was alone. Around midnight, I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps outside the tent. Slow, careful, not the shuffle of animals. My hands froze. I told myself it was the wind, that I was imagining things. But the pressure in the air made my skin crawl. Morning revealed the truth. Tracks surrounded my tent, not human, not animal. Long, thin, with joints bending in impossible angles. Some circled my campsite, then disappeared. Into the sand, into nothing. I packed up quickly, trying to push the fear aside. Over the next few days, the desert began to reveal itself as something more than empty land. Shadows moved in ways that defied physics. A ridge that should have been to my left suddenly appeared to my right. Rocks seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. And always, just at the edge of my vision, there were figures, tall, thin, heads tilted, pacing slowly. They never approached directly, but I could feel their awareness, their observation. On the fourth day, I made a mistake. I climbed a small rise to get a better view of the terrain. At the top, I saw a structure that didn't belong, a small shack made of old wood and metal, half buried in sand. Curiosity overcame my fear. I walked toward it. As I got closer, I noticed symbols carved into the door, strange markings that looked ancient, like something older than the desert itself. The door hung slightly ajar. I pushed it open. Inside was a room small enough to barely stand in. Sand covered the floor, and a thin layer of dust coated the walls. But what drew my attention was a journal on a shelf. The writing was old, faded, but legible. Page after page chronicled someone else's journey through this desert, someone who had come alone and vanished. The entries grew increasingly frantic, words describing figures that moved like shadows but breathed like humans, tracks that twisted and disappeared in the air, and finally a single line written in large, frantic letters. Do not stay. It watches. It learns. I closed the journal, my heart racing. A sudden sound, a scraping like fingernails across wood, made me spin. Nothing was there. I ran back to my truck and drove without stopping, the shack disappearing behind a ridge as though it had never existed. By the fifth day, reality itself was betraying me. Trails I had memorized twisted back into themselves. Mountains seemed closer, then farther away. The figures I had glimpsed before, always distant, always tilting their heads, were now in my direct path. One stood in the middle of the dirt road, impossibly tall, thin, and still. Its head tilted at that same wrong angle. I slammed the brakes, but when I tried to swerve, the truck felt heavier, slower, as if the desert itself resisted my movement. I floored it. The figure vanished. At camp that night, I barely slept. The air pressed in, heavy, unnatural. I felt them circling my tent, judging, learning. I thought I saw shadows slip through the walls. My flashlight revealed nothing, but I knew they were there. On the sixth day, dehydration and fear began to fracture my mind. I saw other travelers, men, women, walking the dunes, calling my name. I ran to them, but they dissolved into heat haze, leaving only sand. I heard whispers that weren't carried on the wind, but inside my head, soft, deliberate, my own voice, repeating words I hadn't said. The desert had learned enough to mimic me. By the seventh day, I had become convinced the desert itself was alive, not just sand and rock, but the whole land, aware, patient, hungry. I began moving at night when shadows masked me. I tried to follow the ridges, using memory, instinct, anything. But the desert twisted around me. Tracks I followed disappeared. My truck seemed to appear in places I hadn't driven. I realized I was not just lost. I was being studied. The eighth day brought the figures closer. I saw them pacing the dunes around me, always at a distance, always tilting their heads as if comparing me to something. And then I saw it, one of them moving with my own gait, mimicking me perfectly. Every movement, every gesture. The desert was learning me, absorbing me, preparing to replace me. I understood then the truth. It didn't need to kill me. It wanted to become me. Panic overtook me. I ran, stumbling across sand and rock. The desert stretched endlessly, each dune taller than the last, each canyon deeper. Time lost meaning. I drank from my remaining water, ate scraps of food, barely conscious of the sun that burned overhead. Figures followed silently, patient, learning. On the ninth day, I reached a ridge I thought might lead to a road. Exhaustion nearly killed me. I crawled to the top, and the desert opened below, a valley filled with dunes I had never seen, stretching farther than the eye could reach. And standing there, at the edge, were dozens of figures, tall, thin, heads tilting, silent and observing. Some moved in strange ways, crawling along the sand like spiders, others pacing in perfect rhythm. I realized then the desert was infinite, and I had only wandered into a small corner of its true expanse. I slept fitfully that night, hidden in a small alcove. In my dreams, I saw the figures mimic me, stand where I slept, move as I moved, tilt their heads as I tilted mine. And in the morning, I realized the worst part. Even if I survived, they would continue to learn. On the 10th day, desperation drove me to keep moving. I followed what I hoped were faint tire tracks, winding through canyons and washes. My body was near collapse, and then I saw it. A road. Asphalt, cracked and faded, leading to civilization. My heart leapt. I ran. The figures did not pursue, not yet. The desert had boundaries, at least for now. I reached a small town outside the desert foothills. I collapsed in a diner, shaking, dehydrated, muttering about shadows, figures, and tracks that vanished into air. No one believed me. I had no evidence, no photos, nothing tangible. They thought I was hallucinating, insane from heat stroke. Maybe I was, but I know the truth. The desert watches. It learns. It remembers. And one day it will find me again. I see it sometimes, in shadows in the mountains, in reflections, in corners of rooms I leave unlit, its tall, thin form, its wrong-angled head, tilting, patient. And I know the desert is still alive out there, waiting for the next wanderer, the next person foolish enough to believe it is empty. I survived the desert, but I'm not the same, and I fear, every time I close my eyes at night, that what it has learned about me is only the beginning. Hope this story followed you into the dark. Like, comment, and subscribe for more nightmares.